Space exploration is one of humanity's greatest achievements, but the path has been costly. We'll start at tragic and finish at catastrophic. 5. The Apollo 1 fire. On January 27, 1967, 3 astronauts were sealed inside their command module for what was supposed to be a routine launch rehearsal. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee weren't going anywhere. It was just a ground test. But a series of critical design choices had turned their tiny cabin into a bomb waiting for a spark. The first problem was the air. The capsule's atmosphere wasn't normal air. It was 100% pure oxygen, pressurized to 16.7 pounds per square inch, higher than the air pressure outside. This created an environment where materials that are normally non-flammable could catch fire and burn with explosive speed. There were other warning signs. Command pilot Gus Grissom had hung a lemon on the simulator, a joke about the endless technical problems. He'd reported a strange, sour buttermilk smell from the oxygen system. Communications were so bad that day, filled with static, that Grissom exclaimed, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" These were all treated as minor glitches. Then, a spark from damaged wiring under a seat ignited the oxygen. The fire spread with unimaginable speed. In that environment, the pressure inside the cabin spiked instantly, building with so much force that it ruptured the capsule's inner hull. The pressure jumped from 16.7 to over 36 pounds per square inch in a fraction of a second. The force of the rupture was so violent it knocked a ground crew worker standing on the gantry off his feet. And here is where the design became a death trap. The hatch was designed to open inward. With the internal pressure now far greater than the pressure outside, it was physically impossible to open. The crew was sealed inside their own tomb. The entire event, from the first call of fire to the final, garbled transmission, lasted only 17 seconds. The ground crew outside fought to get to them, but the intense heat and thick, toxic smoke drove them back. It took 5 agonizing minutes to get the hatch open. By then, it was far too late. The official cause of death wasn't the fire itself, but asphyxiation from the poisonous gases released by burning plastics and nylon. Their suits had melted, fusing the men to the inside of the cabin. But as horrific as this was, the next disaster was born not from a technical flaw found too late, but from one that was known from the very beginning. 4. The crash of Soyuz. 1. In April 1967, just 3 months after Apollo 1, the Soviet Union was preparing its own major space mission. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was set to launch alone aboard the brand-new Soyuz 1 spacecraft. But behind the scenes, everyone knew the mission was doomed. The Soyuz was a death trap. Engineers had documented over 200 structural faults, ranging from faulty wiring to a flawed parachute system. But the mission was rushed forward by political leaders who demanded a spectacular spaceflight to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The warnings were ignored. Komarov knew he was flying to his death. His backup pilot was his close friend, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Gagarin had argued and pleaded to take Komarov's place, knowing the flight was suicidal, but the state would never risk their national hero. So Komarov went, reportedly to save his friend. Before leaving, he insisted on an open casket funeral, to make sure the men who sent him would see what they had done. The problem started immediately after reaching orbit. One of the 2 solar panels failed to deploy, starving the craft of power. Without it, navigation systems failed and the spacecraft began to tumble uncontrollably. For 13 agonizing orbits, Komarov fought the dying machine, attempting a manual re-entry that had never been done under such conditions. Some unconfirmed reports from American listening posts claimed to have overheard his final, furious transmissions, cursing the engineers who had built his coffin. As the capsule plunged back to Earth, the main parachute failed to deploy. The backup chute then tangled in the smaller drogue chute, becoming useless. The capsule slammed into the ground near Orenburg at over 140 kilometers per hour. The impact was so violent it flattened the entire module. The landing rockets, meant to soften the touchdown, instead detonated on impact, engulfing the wreckage in a chemical fire that melted the metal hull. When the recovery team arrived, they found a smoldering crater. The metal of the capsule was still burning, molten from the heat of the fire. They had to use shovels to throw dirt onto the wreckage just to extinguish the flames. There was almost nothing left of Komarov. Eyewitnesses described his remains as a charred, unrecognizable lump, roughly 30 centimeters wide and 80 centimeters long. All that was identifiable was a single, calcined heel bone. As he had demanded, his remains were displayed in an open casket, a silent, horrifying testament to the cost of political ambition. The next tragedy, however, would not happen in secret. It would be broadcast live for the entire world to see. 3. The Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger was set to launch. This mission was a massive media event. On board was Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher who was set to become the first civilian in space. Millions of people, including countless schoolchildren, were watching live, but behind the scenes there was a frantic debate. The weather in Florida was colder than any previous launch, well below freezing. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, issued stark warnings. They were terrified that critical rubber seals, called O-rings, would become stiff in the cold and fail to contain the explosive gases inside the boosters. The night before the launch, they pleaded with NASA managers to postpone, presenting data that showed a clear danger. But NASA officials, under immense pressure to maintain a busy launch schedule, overruled them. One manager infamously told the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. The launch was approved. 73 seconds after liftoff, their worst fears became reality. A faulty O-ring on the right solid rocket booster failed, allowing a jet of superheated gas to escape. This flame acted like a blowtorch, burning through the external fuel tank and causing a catastrophic structural failure. In a flash, the shuttle was engulfed in a massive fireball. On the ground, cheers turned to screams. The live television broadcast captured the moment of stunned silence, followed by the NASA commentator's famous, faltering words. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation, obviously a major malfunction. For the families of the astronauts and for millions of children watching in their classrooms, it was a national trauma unfolding in real time. But here's the most disturbing part. The crew of 7 didn't die in that explosion. The crew cabin, a reinforced section of the orbiter, was torn free from the fireball intact. It continued to climb for another 25 seconds before beginning a long, terrifying fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. When the wreckage of the cabin was recovered from the ocean floor, investigators made a chilling discovery. 3 of the crew's personal emergency air packs had been manually activated. This means that at least some of the astronauts were alive, conscious, and aware as they plunged for nearly 3 minutes toward an impact they could not survive. But while Challenger was lost in the first moments of its flight, the next shuttle disaster would unfold at the very last. 2. The Columbia disaster. The fate of Space Shuttle Columbia and its 7 astronauts was sealed just 82 seconds after it launched on January 16, 2003. But nobody knew it for 16 days. During ascent, a piece of foam insulation about the size of a briefcase broke off the external tank. It was traveling at over 800 kilometers per hour when it slammed into the leading edge of the shuttle's left wing, punching a hole in the fragile heat shield. Now here's the uncomfortable part. This was not a new problem. Foam strikes had happened on many previous flights. NASA had begun to see it as a routine maintenance issue, not a critical safety threat. It was a phenomenon later called the normalization of deviance, when you get so used to a problem that you stop seeing it as a problem at all. While the crew orbited Earth for 2 weeks, conducting experiments and completely unaware of the danger, a tense debate was happening on the ground. A team of engineers saw the launch footage and were deeply concerned. They formally requested that the military use its powerful spy satellites to take a closer look at the wing. NASA management denied the request. The managers concluded that even if the damage was confirmed to be critical, there was nothing that could be done. There was no plan for an in-orbit repair and no rescue mission was prepared. The crew was told the foam strike was not a concern and the 16-day mission continued as planned. On February 1, 2003, Columbia began its re-entry. As it hit the upper atmosphere, superheated gases hotter than molten lava blasted through the hole in the wing. The heat shield was breached. Inside the wing, the gases began to melt the aluminum structure from the inside out. In the cockpit, the final moments were a cascade of alarms as the shuttle lost control. The last voice communication came from Commander Rick Husband, who calmly said, "Roger, before the transmission cut off. 16 minutes from landing, the shuttle disintegrated over Texas, leaving a trail of debris across the sky. The subsequent recovery effort was the largest in American history. More than 25,000 people from 270 organizations combed an area spanning thousands of square miles across East Texas and Louisiana. Over 84,000 pieces of debris were recovered, including the crew's remains, allowing investigators to piece together exactly what had happened. But our final story is perhaps the most chilling. It is the only time in history that human beings have died in the silent, unforgiving vacuum of space itself. 1. The asphyxiation of Soyuz 11. In June 1971, the 3 cosmonauts of Soyuz 11 were heroes. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Petsayev had just completed a record-breaking 23-day stay aboard Salyut 1, the world's first space station. They were on their way home. Their mission aboard the station had been difficult. Upon first entering Salyut 1, they were met with a smoky, burnt atmosphere from a faulty ventilation system. They had to retreat to their Soyuz capsule for the first night while ground control worked on a fix. It was another sign of the risks being taken in the early days of space stations. But there's a disturbing piece of backstory here. These 3 men were the backup crew. The original crew, which included the legendary Alexei Leonov, was grounded just 4 days before launch because one member was wrongly suspected of having tuberculosis. It turned out to be a simple allergy. That last-minute swap sent this crew to their deaths. Another critical detail. To fit 3 men into a capsule designed for 2, the engineers had removed the bulky pressure suits. The cosmonauts were flying in simple cloth coveralls. As their Soyuz capsule separated from the station to begin its journey home, the shock from the separation bolts firing jolted open a tiny pressure equalization valve. Instantly, the capsule's breathable atmosphere began venting into the vacuum of space. The leak was catastrophic. The valve was hidden under their seats, impossible to reach. The entire cabin depressurized in just over 100 seconds. The crew had maybe 15 seconds of useful consciousness. Inside, the sudden pressure drop would have caused the air to fog up as water vapor condensed, followed by a deafening roar of escaping air. In the chaos, the cosmonauts would have desperately tried to find the source of the leak, but with no suits and no time, their efforts were doomed. At an altitude of 168 kilometers, the effects were immediate. The nitrogen in their blood began to bubble out of solution, a condition called embolism, causing fatal strokes and hemorrhages. They lost consciousness before they could even understand what was happening. Flight recorder data showed that Patsayev's heart stopped 40 seconds after the leak began. And now for the ghastly final act. The capsule's automated systems continued to work perfectly. For the entire re-entry, ground control was communicating with a dead crew, receiving telemetry from a flawless, automated machine. It performed a perfect soft landing in the Kazakh steppe. The recovery team raced to the site, expecting to greet their returning heroes. They knocked on the hatch and got no response. When they forced it open, they found the 3 men lifeless in their seats, with dark blue patches on their faces and blood from their noses and ears. They were still warm. In a heartbreaking scene, doctors pulled them onto the grass and performed CPR, knowing it was hopeless. As a direct result of this, all Soyuz crews from that day forward were required to wear pressure suits during launch and landing. To this day, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev are the only human beings to have died above the Kármán line, the official boundary of space.